that. Absolutely lovely. Right, I want to shift us now onto high frequency checks for listening, if that's okay. So just a bit of background here, Pritesh. So I'm going to come out of this bad, but we'll just go for it anyway. So for about the first 12, 13 years of my career, huge mistake I made was all my emphasis on check for understanding was just on checking for understanding. So I'd use diagnostic questions a lot. Latterly, I'd use mini whiteboards and so on. But then I came to realize that if you're not actually going to respond to that check for understanding, you're wasting your time. And again, a lot of CPD around check for understanding tends to leave out the responsive teaching element. And I still see lots of lessons where, let's say, teachers ask a diagnostic question, half the kids have gone for A, half the kids have gone for B. And the teacher's like, well, yeah, A's the correct answer, explains it, and then cracks on. And if you're not going to use the data in front of you, well, what's the point in asking it? So I'm a bit better at responsive teaching now, but I think the thing I'm still not good at, and I need to work on this, and you're going to help me with this, is the other bit that needs, the responsive teaching has to come after check for understanding. But before check for understanding, it has to be this check for listening, right? Because if the kids aren't listening, it doesn't matter how good your check for understanding questions are, they're not going to know them because they haven't been paying attention. So I want to take a bit of a deep dive on this check for listening, and particularly these high frequency checks for listening. So can you just start us off by telling us what is a check for listening and why is it so important for you to do?
So a check for listening, it does what it says on the tin, but it's a really simple question that you're asking students straight after you've explained a sentence or two, maybe three at the most. So you might say something like, let's say you're talking about cells that make up organisms. You might say, right, all organisms are made of cells. And in the first instance, a check for listening might be something as simple as, I say, you say, cells, and the whole class in unison does a choral response, and they respond with cells. So again, it's just a way of involving them in your explanation that doesn't require any deviation from your explanation. It's just a repetition as a way of holding their attention. You know, it almost wakes anyone up who had fallen asleep is now awake. Hopefully not literally. And so that might be one example. And you say, right, so all organisms are made of cells. So we are animals. Animals are made of cells. Plants are also made of cells. Right. Animals, are they made of cells? Yes or no? On three. One, two, three. Yes. Is a table made of cells? On three. One, two, three. So like it's very simple things just to see if they are following your explanation, whether they're with you. It might be, right, tell your partner a sentence with the word animals and the word cells in it. Off you go. Okay, and then you'd expect them to say something like, oh, animals are made of cells. Great. So it's a question that if somebody who understands English is able to hear you give an explanation, you can be 100% sure that they're able to then answer that question. And that's why the idea of check for listening ties in so well with all hands up cold calling, because when you then ask a check for listening, you should and can expect 100% of hands up. Whereas if I had said something like, oh, what is inside a cell? And I haven't explained that to them yet. And obviously no one's going to have the hands up unless you've read about it before. So I wouldn't expect 100% hands up for that question. So a check for listening is very deliberate because it does two things. Number one, it forces every student to participate, and therefore it helps them to keep paying attention to what it is that you're saying. And then number two, it just gives you feedback about your explanation and whether the kids are in that moment with you as well, following and listening. Not necessarily, again, you're not making an inference that they've understood what you're saying. Like they're just parroting back. Animals are made of cells. They don't know what a cell is because maybe if you haven't shown them yet, but at least they've listened to the word and they've put the two things together. Animal, cells. Okay, that's what it's made of, whatever that means. So you have to be careful with your inferences there about what that tells you when they can successfully answer a check for listening, but you know that they've heard the content that you've said. And that is as the baseline of what you want in your lesson, right? It doesn't matter how terrible the explanation. I could be saying goobledy means goobledy goo. They're the same thing. What does goobledy mean? If they can't say goobledy goo, then you know they haven't been paying attention. So that's not check for understanding. You don't care yet whether or not they've understood. You just want to check they're listening. And the second reason, another reason it's important as well, it's a chance to give merit. It's a
Mm,
chance to show that attention is great. It's something that you really value. You care for them, for their part. You care to hear their voice when they have the chance to participate. If you pick a student, say, tell me what gobbledy is, and say, oh, gobbledy is gobbledygoo. Yeah, great. I love that you're paying attention. You're reinforcing the idea that listening to the teacher is something that's good and it's going to help them and it's really important. Um, and the other thing it's really good for is building self-esteem. Um, and I think this is something that I feel very passionately about because sometimes you see things online, about self-esteem and anxiety and all these kinds of things. And, there's like, oh, let's do a lesson on how we can build up our self-esteem. And, whilst there's invaluable knowledge that I'm sure those lessons contain about it, unless you're then practicing giving students actual opportunities every lesson to build their self-esteem, to build their confidence, then anything else you do around it isn't going to land as well. So it's great for building self-esteem because when students can feel successful in the lesson, that's so important for the joy factor, for your relationship with them, because they start to trust you more. When I listen to Sir, I can answer lots of questions. I'm learning and it's wonderful. And you want that. And that's, when you asked me earlier about the Swiss rolls and the smile on their faces, actually checks for listening bring huge joy in the classroom because the whole class's hands are going up. Boom, they're coming back down. Great answer, they're getting merit. Team, we're on fire today. We're all putting our hands up and we're getting all these questions right. They don't know that they don't know this is a check for listening and it's different to a check for understanding. That's for you to know. Um, because as you're asking, you're not saying, right, I'm going to first start by asking checks for listening, then I'm going to progress on to asking checks for understanding. You're not narrating that to them. As far as they're concerned, sometimes they find questions easier, sometimes they find them harder. They don't know the difference why. But for you, it's your chance to say, gosh, look at you. You guys are great at this. Let's see if we can ask you something even more challenging now. So it's just wonderful for culture building as well. Yeah, there's just so many benefits. I love it.
yeah, I love it too. I've been experimenting with this. I absolutely love it. I just want to dive into this a bit more. What are your kind of key means of participation for the checks for listening, Pritesh? So, and I wonder if you can give us like a rough breakdown and maybe even a little example of each. So, I'm guessing all hands up cold calling is going to be a big part of this. Choral response, I think you mentioned in one of your blogs, is going to be a key part. But would anything else come into play? Would a turn and talk be involved in a check for listening? Can you just give us a bit of an overview of what would be your main go-to means of participation and maybe a couple of examples of each if possible?
Yeah, I think you've essentially covered them. I think we'll talk about this later in a sense, the three phases of questioning. So you've got your checks for listening. The middle one is a rehearsal, and I think that I would never do a rehearsal I would only use a rehearsal if there's like a sentence that I want to check that they've listened to, not a one-word answer. So if it's a one-word answer that I want to check that they've heard, it's just a call response. It might be something like, um, I don't know. Let's say let's carry on with the idea of cells. We might say, right, this is the cytoplasm of the cell. This is where chemical reactions happen. Where do chemical reactions happen? On three, 1, 2, 3, and they all say cytoplasm. Oh, what happens in the cytoplasm? Hands up. Who can tell me? Uh, Craig. Oh, in the cytoplasm, chemical reactions happen. Great, well done. If they stumbled a little bit there, I wouldn't mind because look, it is literally a brand new word. They probably only pronounce it's hard to pronounce, and they're tying it to a second fact. But as long as I can sense that they've heard what I'm saying and they're giving it a go, that's the main thing. Um, but I would expect them to be able to essentially repeat the key ideas that I've just said to them. Um, so those are the two main ones. So all hands up, cold calling, like I just demonstrated, and call response. And then usually if I do use turn and talk, that will be more for a rehearsal. So let's say I've talked about the cytoplasm and I've talked about the cell membrane. I say, oh, who can remember what the cell membrane and the cytoplasm does? Oh, right, why don't you practice with your partners? Go. But you get a sense first. If all hands go up, I might just be like, oh, we all remember. Great. Let's go to so and see what they have to say. And there I might pick someone who I think is maybe a slightly weaker student that I think maybe might not get it. And if they get it, it's probably likely that everyone else gets it. Um, and if only half the hands go up, great, turn and talk, and that 50% turns to 100%. If only a couple of hands go up, I'd be like, oh, maybe we need to go over it again. Who can remember just the cytoplasm, what that one does? Oh, okay, we're more confident with that. Let's start with that. Practice with your partners. So you're constantly because you've got a culture of hands up, then suddenly the number of hands up is a better, truer representation of whether students think they know or think they're not, they don't know. And you can trust the hands up as a more accurate, reliable proxy of their knowledge than if you didn't have that culture and you say hands up. And let's say three hands go up. If you don't have a culture of hands up, you don't know if that's because they don't understand. You don't know if it's because they weren't listening. You don't know if they can't be bothered. You don't know if if it's because they just don't want to participate. And that's why all of these strategies together just kind of, it's like synergy of they just reinforce each other and give you more and more powerful data the more these strategies tie together.
Yeah, this is lovely. There's just a few more things on this check for listening. Would you do you ever kind of bounce it around? So if a child, well, firstly, is there ever any value in one child's giving you the right answer, then just like asking another child just to make sure? Does it tend to just be one child per check for listening? And also, would you be doing checks for listening on what peers have said, if that makes sense? So Tom's given an answer. Would you then say, Emma, what did Tom just say? So how does it play out in those scenarios?
Good question again. I think, yes, you can bounce it around, but I think again, it's you're weighing up your sense of what value that
Yeah.
adds in that moment. So if the first student gives an answer and it's absolutely perfect and it's a really strong student, then you might want to check in with a student who struggles a little bit more. So they've had an extra opportunity to hear
Mm,
a well
mm,
modeled answer, and you might see that as a valuable opportunity. If from just the confidence with their hands up, you think, do you know what? They all look like they've got it. Let me just do a quick check. Oh yeah, this kid's got it. Then you can just move on. And you can be more confident that more of them have got it with other students' answers as well. If it's incorrect, I don't want someone else repeating that answer. I'll just want to move on quickly with the right answer, unless it's like a really common mistake, in which case I might say, oh, that's actually quite a common mistake because da da da, and then I'll check to see whether everyone has heard my explanation of why that's wrong. Or this is a common mistake because. And it's really sweet when they answer those kinds of questions because especially once the culture's right, they'll say, "Oh, this person made a mistake, but that's quite common because,"
that's
and they're trying
nice.
to be really careful about it, and you just know that you've got a nice, friendly environment in the classroom, and I think that's really important because again, that's one of the strategies you're using to build a culture of error. To say, actually, it's really valuable for showing that mistake. We're actually going to spend some time looking at this mistake because it's so important, so valuable for us to learn from. Um, so yeah, I think it's important they listen to each other, but you want to manage their attention because if you're just getting them to repeat the wrong
Yeah.
answer just to check that they were listening to that other student's answer, you don't want to reinforce that as something that they think is correct.
Makes sense. Final question on checks for listening. One thing I particularly loved about your blog post is the diagram you've got of a teacher giving an explanation and the kind of attention is falling, 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 and then maybe it goes up a little bit when you start doing your checks for understanding, versus in your classroom when you're giving the explanation and you've got these frequent high frequency checks for listening, you sustain that high level attention throughout. So I really, really like that. I guess, playing devil's advocate, one thing you could argue is it disrupts the flow of your explanation. So sometimes what I'll want is I want all kids' attention on me, and I'll want to give perhaps, 20-second, 30-second, maybe even a minute explanation because I'm trying to tie these ideas together. And what I don't want to do is constantly stop and say, what did I just say there? What did I just say there? Now, of course, I can see the argument because if they're not listening to me for that minute, I'm wasting my time. But is there a danger that these regular checks for listening do break up the flow of an explanation?
Yeah, great question. Um, First of all, I'm glad that maths teachers appreciated my graph.
It
That's made
was
me
good.
very happy. Um, I think that I feel you, and there are times when I'm speaking, and I do just carry on speaking because I think I don't want to interrupt the flow of this particular explanation. But I think there are two conditions that need to be met. I mean, this is a roughly. Obviously, there'll be times when there are exceptions, but I think there are two conditions that need to be met before you can talk for an extended period of time without asking checks for listening. And the first one is you've established that culture already quite a lot, so you can be more sure that they are following your explanation. And I think it's important to look at the kids while you're doing that. Like if they're all like watching you and some of them I love a good nodder. If the kid's nodding along while I'm speaking, I'm like, great, they're with me. That's a good little proxy. Um, and then the second condition that needs to be met is, even when you were explaining to me that you do that sometimes when you want to tie different things together, I think that's fine. But when you were explaining the individual bits initially, if you use checks for listening, then when you then tying it together, you can talk for long because you know that they've listened to all the individual bits, but they do just need to focus on and just listen in a very short space of time how those three or four things connect together for them to actually grasp the idea. Because if you're interrupting yourself when you're tying things together, that doesn't make sense. It defeats the point because you're not then tying it together necessarily. Um, so I think you have to, if those two conditions are met, then it makes sense. Um, and I guess a general rule in teaching, I think that applies here is the idea of what you're constantly doing with a class is like at the end of the day, what is a check for listening? It's a scaffold to ensure your students are paying attention. If you can be sure without using checks for listening that they're paying attention, you might not necessarily need them. So what you do is you provide the scaffold and then you take it away and you see how they do. And then if it all comes crashing down, you put the scaffold back in place. So if you deliver an explanation that's quite complicated and you don't ask any checks for listening and they all absolutely smash it, then that's great. You've created a good enough culture in that class where it's not necessary. And, maybe it was the time of day. I mean, who knows what those factors are? You'll know your class. Some classes generally their attention is really strong. Maybe it's some certain kids that need the checks for listening, and you might check in with them a little bit more. But everyone else, you just let them have the uninterrupted explanation, and you just do a lot more independent practice with them. So it depends on lots of factors, but you're adding the scaffolding. You're always removing the scaffolding. The goal as a teacher is to always remove the scaffolding, but then you have to be good at judging. Have they survived without the scaffold, or are they flailing around? And then you're putting it back in. But the best teachers I've seen are constantly kind of in and out with the scaffolding to see how well their class can do. And I'd say this is no different.
Brilliant. Right, mate, should we pause there? Let me just hit stop here.